Well, in this brief video, we're going to talk about how the government influences the economy. There are two different tools that the government has at its disposal to influence the economy itself, and those are both fiscal policy as well as monetary policy. For this brief video, we're going to focus on fiscal policy and explaining what that is and really how that works. How does it actually affect the economy as a whole? But fiscal policy is the government's use of taxation as well as spending in an attempt to influence the economy. Okay? Monetary policy are attempts by the government to influence the economy by controlling the money supply or the amount of money in circulation. The primary body or government entity that is in charge of monetary policy is the Federal Reserve Bank. As I said before, we're not going to get into too much on monetary policy. This video is going to focus on fiscal policy and ultimately what the effect is. But back to fiscal policy, we talked about those two different avenues that the government has to essentially affect the economy or influence the economy. The first of which is taxation, of course, being the amount of money that you and I, of course, pay in taxes every year. And also spending. The government is obviously a big spender and has a lot of assets at its disposal, and it can in turn use those particular assets to spend towards different projects with an attempt to influence the economy. So you might ask, really, well, how does that work? Why does what the government does with regards to taxation and what it spends, why does it matter? And if you look at this brief diagram I have here, the government spending, the government is a very, very large entity, obviously. It controls a lot of money. And so one example I'm going to provide is the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008. Remember that this was signed by President George Bush at the time. And at this point in time, we were kind of potentially getting into the economic recession that we all know as of now obviously did take place. And so in an attempt to maybe lessen the harmful effects of the recession, or ideally eliminate the effects entirely, they signed and approved the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008. And if you remember, that particular act made it so that there was an additional payment issued to U.S. citizens in certain dollar amounts. I believe the amount was $600 per individual and potentially up to $1,200 per couple. Now, that might be a little different, but that's roughly the dollar amounts and what they are. And that was a payment that was made directly to consumers, directly to people like you and I, okay? Because the idea behind it was that if we in turn had an increased surplus of money, access to funds that we didn't normally have, that we would probably spend that, right? If you look at savings rates in the U.S., we are historically very, very poor savers. We spend a lot of money. We don't necessarily shelve any of it for future use, at least as a whole. Okay, I know individually some people are really good, but as a whole, the United States, we like to spend money. That's what we do. And so the government says, you know what? What if we were to give people money that they didn't normally have? Anywhere from $600 to $1,200 roughly. They would in turn probably spend that. And so if we gave people access to money, they would in turn spend that money. And that would do is that would inject that back into the economy, right? Because you're paying for goods and services, okay? Which would in turn mean that businesses now have more demand, okay? And then of course, what happens when businesses have increased demand? You know, they may not have the human resources or the labor necessary to accommodate or fulfill that demand. And what that causes businesses to do is businesses to hire, right? And so we can hopefully affect the unemployment rate. And then once people have jobs, they in turn have access to money and disposable incomes that they can in turn re-inject back into the economy, because the logic being is someone who's unemployed probably is not going to have a great deal of disposable income. They're probably not going to be spending a great deal of money on different goods and services, which is going to affect our GDP, or gross domestic product, which is essentially the income of a country. It's the total value of goods and services that a particular country produces within a given year. Now, one important factor to consider is that 2/3 of GDP is dependent upon consumer spending. It's dependent upon people like you and I going out there and purchasing various goods and services. Okay? It's a very, very big component. And so you can see if consumers like you and I aren't spending money, if we are holding back what we have because we're